Welcome to the Deathcast.
Sunday, October 7th, 2001. Two men, 46-year-old Christopher Adams and his friend, Booray Parnell, are at Parnell's mother's home in Waxahachie, Texas. They have met to discuss an upcoming wrestling show that Adams plans to put on. Soon, however, the two men began drinking and watching a movie. Eventually, Adams and Parnell would begin arguing over what no one is really certain. When it was over, Parnell would be injured, and Adams would be fatally shot. What you are about to hear is an excerpt from filmmaker Mickey Grant's film, Gentleman's Choice. In this small excerpt, which Mickey has graciously allowed me to use, you will hear Parnell describe in his own words what happened that evening.
Right then, he started cussing at me and getting louder. He pushed me, and I kind of went against this post and started to swing. Well, I hit the post, getting it out of his hand, and my whole hand was black. And we went through. We knocked out 5 or 6 window panes. We cracked into them, and then we somehow came back around this way, and he just overweighted me and pushed me back on the bed. He jumped on top of me and started trying to gouge my eyes out. I grabbed this pistol and I hit him about 3 times in the head to try to knock sense into him. And he just kept getting stronger. And I was at the point I was just about to pass out. I mean, he had my air cut off. I couldn't breathe. And hell, I really couldn't. I mean, if I couldn't punch him with that pistol and knock sense into him, my fists wouldn't have been a bit of good. That's when I knew it was me or him, and I had no choice but to shoot him.
Hello again, and welcome to the Deathcast. I am your host, best-selling independent author Ian Totten, and I'd like to thank you for joining me once again. This week we're going to be looking at the murder of professional wrestler Chris Adams at the hands of his friend Booray Parnell. You heard the trailer there for the show this week. That was Booray talking about the night that he shot Chris and actually committing the murder. I'd like to thank my friend Mickey Grant for allowing me to use that clip. It's from his documentary, Gentleman's Choice, which you can find on YouTube right now and also on Vimeo. I'd also like to put out there that Mickey is going through a extremely difficult time right now because of medical conditions. He's got a lot of medical bills, and if you'd like to make a donation to him to help pay for those medical bills as well as just general cost of living, you can make a donation at paypal.me/Mickey Grant. That's MICKEYGRANT. Any amount is greatly appreciated. Now, before I get into the story of Chris Adams, if you would like to support the show, please go to Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star review. You can also find me on Patreon at Ian Totten, author. I am on Instagram at Ian Totten, author, as well as Twitter at Author Totten. You can find me on Facebook at Ian Totten, author. If you'd like to help with the production of the show, you can find me on PayPal and Venmo at Ian Totten. With that, grab something to drink, sit back and relax. I've got my coffee, I've got my cigarettes. Let's go into the crypt. Alright, so the death or murder, depending on how you want to look at it, of Chris Adams, chose this one this week because if you don't know me in real life, I am a major professional wrestling fan, and when I say professional wrestling, I'm not talking what's currently out there, but the stuff from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And back then, it was not just one or two companies. There were companies all over the country that were known as territories, and most of them worked underneath the umbrella of an organization called the National Wrestling Alliance. And out of these territories, you got guys like Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, Jerry Lawler, but you also got international superstars like Chris Adams. I say international because Chris Adams was born February 10th, 1955 in Rugby, England. And he would die on October 7th of 2001 in Waxahachie, Texas. But before we get to that fateful night, we really need to go back and look at who Chris Adams was, where he came from. Adams was the oldest son of Cyril and Jean Adams. And from everything that I could find, he came from a pretty typical working class background in Britain. By the time he was 9 years old, he had started training in judo and would continue in that until he was 14 years old. Adams wasn't alone in the family as far as judo training was. His brother Neil also competed, and they went on to win national and world championships, with Neil going on to win silver medals at both the 1980 and 1984 Summer Olympics. As for Chris, he was a member of Britain's 1976 Summer Olympics judo squad, although he did not compete in the Olympics themselves. He held a black belt in judo and was trained in other forms of martial arts. And it seems that Chris was just an all-around outstanding athlete who, according to his parents, was interested in becoming an architect. Now, somehow he got the idea in his head that he should try professional wrestling, making his debut in 1978 at the age of 23. He was not trained by anyone to be a professional wrestler. Adams instead used his judo background to get by in the ring, as a lot of the types of falls that professional wrestlers take are similar to the types of falls that martial artists take. I think one of the things that probably enticed Adams into the lifestyle of a professional wrestler was the nightlife. Wrestlers were known back in those days to be fairly wild and carefree. They almost like a gypsy, they generally didn't stay in a place very long. Often only a day or so before moving on to the next town. And I have a feeling that, that type of lifestyle appealed to him. When he began wrestling, Adams wrestled for Joint Promotions, which ran from 1952 until 1995. One thing that should be noted about wrestling in Great Britain is it's nothing like it is over here. They have rounds in their matches similar to boxing and other professional fighting sports. Wrestlers in Britain are also known to be shooters or hookers, which, for those who are not aware, a shooter is a legitimate wrestler. The shooter is short for shoot fighting. They're the type of individual who could seriously injure you at any point they wanted to in a match. We've had hundreds of them in the United States. In fact, that's actually how professional wrestling started, was from shoot fighters on the carnival circuit, but most famous probably being Lou Thez and Danny Hodge, who recently passed away. The patriarch of the Hart family in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Stu Hart. These were all shoot fighters, and Britain was known for producing some of the most vicious and rugged shoot fighters in the world. So this is the world that Chris Adams found himself in when he entered the professional ranks. And he wrestled against and alongside such luminaries as Dynamite Kid Tom Billington, who was a noted shooter being trained out of Wigan, and Adrian Street, who is renowned for his shooting ability, despite his smaller stature. So wrestling in Britain was pretty rough and tumble at that point in time. They must have seen something in Adams, however, as he began teaming with a man by the name of Big Daddy, whose real name was Shirley Crabtree, who by that point was the top star in Joint Promotions. Somewhere around this point, Adams began a relationship with Jeannie Clark, who worked for Joint Promotions and eventually took on managing his career. They would have a child together during this period of time, whom they named Jade, and Jeannie Clark might be more familiar to people who with a mainstream professional wrestling mindset as the former wife of Stone Cold Steve Austin. In fact, she's the one who came up with the moniker of Stone Cold. His in-ring skills eventually caught the attention of American promoters, and in 1981, Adams traveled across the world to Los Angeles, where he would compete for judo legends Mike and Gene LaBelle. At this point in his career, Adams was seen as a bit of a high flyer. He did a lot of flips and dives through the ropes onto his opponents. The best that I have seen is that Jeannie Clark traveled over to the U.S. with him at this point, and he was fairly successful wrestling in Los Angeles, winning a number of titles throughout the early 80s. During this time frame, he would also wrestle for Gene LaBelle's Portland wrestling office, as well as taking trips to Mexico, Canada, and Japan. Given what I know about Adams, I would imagine that it was around this period of time that he was probably first introduced to cocaine, as cocaine became extremely prevalent in the American wrestling scene during the 1980s. What I can say with certainty, however, is that when he joined the Von Erich family's World Class Championship Wrestling, based out of Dallas, Texas, in 1983, he was walking into a locker room that was in a full-scale party mode. The wrestlers in the WCCW were treated as rock stars around town, particularly the Von Erich boys, of whom there were 5 children, and sadly only one of them survived past the early 1990s. Adams made his debut on April 15th of 1983, and he was quickly established as an up-and-coming babyface, which in wrestling parlance means he was one of the good guys. And they did this by having interviews with him and allowing him to go over his opponents on television. Going over meaning he won the matches, but they also aligned him with the Von Erich family, who were the top baby faces and draws in the territory, with the patriarch of the Von Erich family, Fritz, going so far as to name him an honorary Von Erich on television. It was around this time that stories about Chris's habits began to slowly leak out here and there, getting rowdy in a bar, in a couple brief scrapes with the law, but nothing too terribly bad. On February 10th, 1984, the first of a string of tragedies would strike world-class championship wrestling when Fritz Von Erich's second oldest son, David, died in Japan of acute enteritis. Basically what that means is that his intestines exploded inside of his body. There's been a lot of stories out there that, other wrestlers had found drugs in his room and that he'd really died of a drug overdose, but none of them are verifiable, and I tend to believe the family's story as they've stuck to it for so long, and nothing has come to light as far as evidence to prove anything differently. The reason I bring this up is the death had a fairly devastating impact on all of the wrestlers who worked for the Von Erich family. And around this time, I have read, is when Chris's drinking and drug usage really began to take off. In December of 1984, Adams married Tony Collins, who was a professional wrestling valet, and they would stay married until 1994. Their marriage produced one child, and I've read various reports that Adams, because of his drinking and drug use, was a pretty erratic individual inside the marriage, oftentimes becoming violent. But we'll get into that shortly. He ended up becoming a major superstar in WCCW, to the point that the Von Erichs decided they needed to turn him and make him a bad guy in order to capitalize on the fame that he was experiencing. And they did this by having him attack the oldest Von Erich son, Kevin, which instantly turned him into the most hated man in the territory. They also teamed him up with another heel that was in the territory, a man by the name of Gino Hernandez. We're going to touch briefly on Gino here because he and Chris's partying lifestyle seemed to mirror each other, in that Gino was renowned for his cocaine usage, and he kind of had that playboy lifestyle in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, with a number of people commenting on the fact that he always had cocaine on him or could get it fairly quickly, as well as having a sugar bowl inside of his apartment that was always kept filled with cocaine. So he and Adams hit it off fairly fast. They were known for their, ring work as well as their hard partying lifestyle. And around this time, people really began to notice a change in Adams' personality, with a number of wrestlers stating that he was a really great guy, a wonderful father to his children, but when he got alcohol in his system, he completely changed, almost a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality, and he would become violent at the drop of a hat. Adams and Hernandez ended up feuding extensively with the Von Erich family before breaking up as a tag team and beginning to feud with themselves. Eventually, Adams was blinded in storyline by what was known as the Freebird hair cream, by Hernandez, and this was done so that he could go on a tour of Japan as well as visit relatives in England. While he was in England, tragedy again struck world-class championship wrestling as Adams' friend and current storyline enemy, Gino Hernandez, who was born Charles Wolfe Jr., was found dead in his apartment of an apparent cocaine overdose, although it was quickly changed to homicide as Hernandez had massive amounts of cocaine in his stomach. I've read some reports stating that he had enough cocaine in his system to kill 5 men. And there are conspiracy theories about Hernandez's death, although it was later ruled to have been death by misadventure. A lot of people have come out and said over the years that Hernandez was killed possibly by drug dealers because he either knew something he shouldn't have or he owed somebody money. This was fed into by the fact that a drug dealer who was later convicted paid for Hernandez's funeral expenses. This death seems to have greatly affected Adams as he really began to spiral after this, culminating with a flight, I believe it was coming back from Jerusalem, where the Von Erichs were megastars, the likes of, a Hulk Hogan. They were on a connecting flight from the Caribbean where Adams, who had been drinking all day, became belligerent with a flight attendant when she told him that he could no longer have any more alcohol. And there's different stories to this, but apparently he began screaming at her. I believe he threatened her, urinated on the floor in the middle of the plane, at which point the co-pilot was summoned. And Kevin Von Erich has said that what happened next was, almost instantaneous. He was calming Chris down when all of a sudden Chris Adams just attacked the co-pilot, and he was over there trying to pull the man off of him. Adams ended up headbutting the man in the face and breaking his nose. And I'm going to read a quick newspaper article from UPI.com concerning the incident. This is dated September 17th, 1986. Wrestler convicted of mile-high assault. Fort Worth, Texas. Professional wrestler who headbutted an airline pilot during a flight from the Caribbean has been convicted of misdemeanor assault and faces up to 6 months in jail. Chris Adams of Dallas was convicted Tuesday for attacking a co-pilot on an American Airlines flight. In addition to a jail term, he faces fines of $500. U.S. District Judge Eldon B. Mahan will sentence Adams next month. The jury rejected a felony charge of interfering with a flight crew member, which could have meant 20 years imprisonment and a fine of up to $250,000. If Adams, a native of Great Britain, had been convicted on the felony, he could have been deported. During the trial, testimony showed Adams headbutted American co-pilot John Bentley 3 times during a June 30th flight after Bentley tried to subdue the wrestler. Adams became unruly because the flight attendants refused to serve him more alcohol. Bentley was not seriously hurt. He suffered a cut on his nose before other wrestlers on the flight to Dallas helped subdue Adams. There was no excuse for him to do what he did, Mahan told jurors after the verdict was announced. He hurt not only himself, but professional sports. It hurt professional wrestling. After his conviction, Adams said the trial was more nerve-wracking than wrestling before 50,000 fans. This incident pretty much signaled the end of Adams' run in WCCW. He would end up doing a short stint in jail before jumping to Bill Watts' Universal Wrestling Federation, which was based out of Bixby, Oklahoma. But for the most part, his time in the spotlight was pretty well done. For a number of years, he would bounce around to the territories that were left at that point, as most of them were dying due to Vince McMahon's national expansion of his WWF. He had a brief stay in WCW, which at that point was owned by Ted Turner. But as with pretty much every wrestling venture Chris undertook after his conviction, it was extremely short-lived, due mostly to his unreliability and unpredictability. During this period of time, he also opened a wrestling school where it was claimed that he trained Stone Cold Steve Austin, who would, as I mentioned earlier, go on to marry Jeannie Clark, Chris's ex. But Austin has stated in interviews since leaving active competition that Adams really didn't train him that much. He just kind of showed him how to fall before throwing him into the ring, and that he, meaning Austin, had to learn what to do inside the ring kind of on the job. While all of this was going on, Adams' personal life continued to deteriorate. In 1990, he was jailed again briefly for 2 DUI convictions, and his reputation in the sport seriously began to deteriorate. Wrestlers said that he would rip them off for money, promising training and then not doing anything, or as Steve Austin put it, blackmail him into coming and working shows and then basically paying him nothing. So he was pretty much at the bottom of the barrel as far as his professional and personal life went. In 1994, he ended up getting a divorce, which, as stated earlier, was directly to his violent actions when he was under the influence. In fact, in 1989, Adams had been arrested for beating his wife, and I have found nothing that indicates that this changed after being arrested. He pretty much skittered along through life over the next few years until 1998, when he was contacted once again by Ted Turner's corporation, World Championship Wrestling, and he was there for a few months, but due to his abrasive nature backstage, he was eventually let go, at which point Chris returned once more to Texas and began promoting shows again, as well as working for other independent promoters. Somewhere during this period, Chris had discovered the drug GHB, which a lot of wrestlers have said they used to use to heighten the effects of alcohol, and that just a little bit could basically put you in a blackout. And it was something that they used to use to prank one another. Chris was quickly addicted to the drug, and in 2000, Chris ended up getting in a relationship with a woman by the name of Linda, whose friends have described her as a, sweet, light-hearted woman who fell head over heels for Chris, and it seems that Chris likewise fell head over heels for her. However, Chris still had his addictions, and he introduced Linda to these addictions. In April of 2000, Chris and Linda were found unresponsive at a friend's home, and I've seen interviews with the man whose house it was, and from all indications, they had gone over there to kind of crash for the night, hang out, and party. At any rate, the man ended up going to bed while the two of them continued their partying ways, and they ended up both passing out, and the man came out and found the two of them unconscious. He was able to revive Chris, but unfortunately he was not able to revive Linda, and she was taken to a hospital where she later died. Again, this had a devastating effect on Chris, and he continued to spiral further and further down. In Mickey Grant's documentary Gentleman's Choice, he does a number of interviews with a stripper by the name of Tracy, who was involved in Chris's life throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it's apparent in this interview that the woman is heavily intoxicated, and she talks about hanging out with Chris and how drugs were almost always involved, as was alcohol. A year after Linda's death, Chris was brought up on manslaughter charges involving her death, which, if he had been convicted, he was facing a likely lengthy prison sentence of up to 20 years. However, that was not to come to pass. Chris's best friend was a man by the name of Brent, Booray Parnell, who lived in Waxahachie, Texas. And it's been described that Booray was Chris's best friend. Chris had trained him somewhat in professional wrestling and would often promote and use Booray in his wrestling shows. At various times they were roommates, but at this point they were living apart from each other, and Chris had gone over to Booray's house ostensibly to discuss a show that Chris wanted to put on. This was on October 7th of 2001. From what Booray later said, they were hanging out, and Chris eventually grew tired of talking about wrestling and decided they should watch a movie. At some point during watching the movie, Chris became enraged and began to assault Booray, with Chris eventually breaking off a part of Booray's bed and striking him with it before grabbing him up in a judo chokehold. They ended up busting through the front window of the house before falling back onto the bed. And as Booray said, he was in fear for his life as, this drunken, drugged up black belt judo was trying to kill him. Adams was still choking him out on the bed when Booray was able to reach a gun, which he hit Adams with numerous times, hoping to break the hold, before finally having to shoot Adams with the gun. Booray was eventually cleared of all charges in the shooting death, as he claimed self-defense. And I've looked at the case files that are available online, and from everything that I have seen, his story really didn't change from one telling to the next, nor did the evidence show anything other than the fact that Adams had attacked him. It wasn't until after Adams' death, however, that the real stories about him began to come out, particularly his violent side. Professional wrestling has always been somewhat of a closed society, and whenever anything would happen involving one of the wrestlers, promoters did everything they could to kind of hush it up and keep it out of the local press, and if they were unable to, they would send them to another territory to work. By the time of Chris's death, what it was known as kayfabe, or the veil of secrecy that had shrouded the wrestling industry, had largely fallen away, which meant that wrestlers felt much more comfortable talking about the real things in wrestling. Sadly, Chris was one of those things that a number of wrestlers decided to talk about. With former WWE announcer Jim Ross stating about Chris Adams, a con man who abused women and had a nasty temper, a manipulator. Unfortunately, that has become Chris Adams' legacy in professional wrestling. In fact, most discussions of Adams invariably lead to talk of his dark side, which unfortunately ultimately ended his life. He was survived by at least 3 children that I am aware of, as well as 3 former wives, the last of which he married a scant 6 weeks before he was shot, whom many people have said Chris only married because she had a steady job and a roof over her head. Again, as Jim Ross said, a manipulator until the very end. That's it for the Deathcast this week. I know it was a much shorter episode than normal. Unfortunately, I'd been planning to put out the third West Memphis 3 episode this week, but given the slight rant that I had gone on last week, I really felt compelled to put the episode out as soon as it had been completed. So this week I decided to go with a story that I was going to cover at a later point during the year. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to learn more about Chris Adams, again, my friend Mickey Grant put out a very good documentary about his life called Gentleman's Choice that can be found for free on YouTube as well as on Vimeo. I know you can also buy an extended director's cut off of Amazon, which is what I have. It is a very good but dark documentary. There's not a lot of light and warmth in that film. Chris had a pretty tragic life of his own making, but it's also pretty eye-opening too. So I can't recommend that highly enough. Once again, before I wrap up for the day, I'd like to thank Mickey Grant for allowing me to use the clips from his documentary Gentleman's Choice at the beginning of the episode. I remind you that if you'd like to make a donation to Mickey to help him pay for medical expenses and general cost of living, you can make a donation at paypal.me/MICKEYGRANT, and any amount is greatly appreciated. Until next week, my friends, stay morbid.
Welcome to the Deathcast.